Good evening, welcome along. My name is Kim and this is Elly. I'm from the Parenting Research Centre and we're here tonight to have a talk about parenting preteens with technology and some positive technology. So I'd like to welcome you along to the webinar, and hopefully a few of you joined us last week when we were talking about parenting preteens positively. And welcome back if you did. Wonderful to have you along. But some of you may be new to our webinars or new to webinars in general. So we're just going to go through a few of the things that you can see on the screen here tonight. So a computer or a laptop will give you the best experience. If you do need to connect via a mobile phone or via tablet, there will be some limitations, but you should still be able to hear us and see us and get most of the information from tonight. Don't worry, there is always a recording of tonight's webinar and that'll be sent out in the next few days. So you should be able to hear us through your headphones or speakers. You should be able to see us as well. We'll be turning the camera on and off during the webinar. That helps stabilise the connection for you as well. And you should be able to see Elly's slide deck just to the left. Now, while you can hear us, you are all on mute. So the way for you to get in contact with us is via the chat box in the left-hand side there for most of you. And you'll be able to ask as many questions as you want. You can comment away and I'll be collecting those questions during the webinar and going through as many of them as I can with Elly at the end. And if you have any tech issues, feel free to jump on, ask any questions. We have Tony here who'll be able to help out. For a lot of tech issues though, it can be solved by a simple refresh. And then, let's see, we'll also be going through a few acknowledgements as well just before we get started. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional owners of East Melbourne where Tony, Elly and I are presenting from tonight. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of wherever you're participating from tonight as well. I'd like to acknowledge the and pay respects to elders past and present of any and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending tonight and also watching the recording later on. These Parenting Now webinars are developed by the Parenting Research Centre in collaboration with Australian experts, brought to you by raisingchildren.net.au and funded by the Victorian Department of Education and Training. This funding from this government allows us to bring you these webinars for free. Okay, so now if anything discussed here this evening brings up any concerns or issues for you, I would like to direct you to raisingchildren.net.au. It has some wonderful hotlines and helplines, as well as a wealth of other resources which will be useful for you. I would also like to explain tonight that we're offering general information only, and if you require more individualised support, please go and see your health professional. Okay, so this webinar tonight is suitable for parents and carers of children aged 9 to 12 who are looking for information around their children using technology as their children become teenagers. This is the second webinar we've held on parenting preteens. So we held a general webinar last week, which I mentioned earlier. Now, if you didn't get a chance to sign up or you didn't get a chance to attend that webinar, we'll actually be sending out a recording of both tonight's webinar and last week's webinar to you all in the next few days. Now, before we get into Elly's webinar, I want to quickly let you know about our next webinar, which is a course in March on anxiety and in your family. So keep an eye out on the Facebook page of raisingchildren.net.au, and you can also sign up to subscribe to hear about any new webinars that we're releasing. Okay, I think that's about it. The webinar itself will go for about 40 minutes and then we'll have about 20 minutes of questions and answers towards the end. But now I'd like to hand you over to the star of the show, Elly, who's a senior specialist here at the Parenting Research Centre. She has extensive experience in adolescent health and welfare as a practitioner and researcher and in workforce development. Her work centres on helping practitioners use evidence in practice, particularly in the areas of mental health and child welfare. She's the co-author of 3 books on parenting adolescents, the most recent being Surviving Adolescence 2.0, and she's the mum of a teenager. And over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I just want to talk a little bit about what we'll be covering tonight. I know there'll be lots of questions and lots of things that people would like to know. So we probably won't get to everything, but as Kim mentioned, please feel free to send questions through. We will cover off on some of the benefits of technology. I want to talk about that because we often hear about the negatives, and yet there's some good things about technology as well. We will talk a little bit about the risks and some strategies to get through the risks, and also some tips around technology use, when to introduce phones and so forth. But again, feel free to ask questions. I want to talk a little bit to start off with about why the preteen years and early teen years are important. There's a lot going on in these years, and there's far less focus on these years than there are in the early years of parenting and the later teenage years. So we often think of this as a quiet period of growth, and yet we know increasingly from research that there's a lot going on for young people at this time. I'll just talk a little bit about each of these. Of course, puberty happens around this time. We know that it's happening at younger ages for young people these days. In the pre-industrial years, the first stage of menstruation was around about 16 years of age. Now it's around about 13 years of age. And a lot of things like diet has contributed to those changes, and it's starting to flatten out now. But it means that those preteen years and early teen years are often that pre-puberty, the signs that you can't see physically, but that are starting around 8 to 9 years of age. A few physical changes such as body odour and sweating that you'd start to notice happening at younger ages, but aren't associated with the secondary sexual characteristics that we usually think about when we think about puberty. At the same time as young people are going through all of this, we throw them into a new school environment. So often that's a transition from a small and caring environment with one teacher to a large impersonal environment where there's multiple teachers and often less of those caring connections than they had in primary school. Unfortunately, this is at a time when we know that young people really need significant adults around them to support them through this transition. So important as parents to understand their needs around that and look for those significant other adults in your children's life. Might be the coach or other adults within the family that can provide that support. Also, what happens in these years are parents are much less involved in the secondary school years, very much a change in the way that the parents interact with schools. And alongside that, we also have changes in the parent-child relationship, which I'll come to in a minute. Very much the thing that we'll talk about tonight is that technology use becomes far more social. So it's the time when we know that your children will start to ask about whether they can open social media accounts, whether they can move into multiplayer gaming, those sorts of decisions. So alongside these other changes, there's changes in the way that they interact with their peers and others online. And lastly, all of this is happening, of course, when there's changing peer and family relationships. Peers are often talked about as becoming more important than parents in particular. But the important thing to remember is that peers don't replace parents. They sit alongside parents. Parents are still incredibly important, and family more broadly, to young people at these ages. So it's important to remember that you still play that role as a guidance, support and advice for your children at this age, even though it seems like the peer group is much more central to their lives at the moment. And the important thing to remember is that these preteen and early teen years are a really important window of opportunity for parents to engage with their children and set up healthy habits before you move into the teen years. So we'll talk about that a bit more, about how it relates to technology tonight. I just wanted to focus on why are we talking about this age group when we talk about technology. And what I wanted to point out is that increasing technology use is not a young person thing. When we look at the statistics, we see that that increase in technology use is happening for all ages. In Australia in particular, what we've seen is that there's 33% more Facebook users aged 65 plus than there are 13 to 17-year-olds. So you can see how this trend happens. 13 to 17-year-olds don't use Facebook anymore because their grandparents are on it. It's not an interesting place for them to be. So as we'll talk about, it's more the Instagram, Snapchat, and gaming sites that young people will go on. But yeah, I wanted to point out that it's often talked about as a young person issue, but really it's an issue for us all. 10 to 12-year-old, again, we talk about that tech use becomes more social. It has both benefits and challenges in that sense, and we'll talk a bit more about them tonight. It's the right time with this age group to encourage what we call good digital citizenship. And by that I mean that they understand and they apply the rules of appropriate and responsible behaviour online, and talking to them about what that means. And again, we'll go through that tonight. Worth pointing out that a smartphone in particular is a very powerful tool at this age group. So when young people are moving through this period of development and the social and psychological changes that are happening in this time, it's important to be your child's navigator through the challenges that the online world and social media can bring, and consider if they're actually ready for a smartphone. And again, we'll talk about this a bit as we go. Just going to introduce a slide so we can have a think about and have a look about smartphones. So this poll is around whether your child has a smartphone yet or not. And I'll get Kim to start the poll.
Okay, so now with the poll, it's just going to come up on the screen, and all you need to do is click on which is the response that best suits you. So does your preteen have a smartphone? And there's a few different options there, and you should be able to see how other people are responding as well.
Okay, so that's interesting to see. At this age, it's good to see that for the preteen ages, the majority of people, we're talking about that it hasn't actually happened yet, which gives you that great opportunity to put rules in place. For those who have, of course, there's different reasons why families would choose to buy smartphones, and we'll talk about those as well. But interesting to see that there's a bit of a spread there, and that will change for different ages. So interesting to see. Thanks for that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the positives about use, because again, we don't see or hear about these. What technology brings is it really allows for a different type of social connection when you're online, regardless of distance or other barriers. What it's great for is things like staying in contact with family who live in other areas, staying in contact with friends who move to other places, and especially good for kids who have particular issues that they might not get the support around them that they need. So if you think about things like children who have social anxiety, letting them be able to communicate online is often a little bit easier, notwithstanding doing things offline with them as well, but often it's a space where they can practice social skills in a safe environment for them. Or they might need support for a particular chronic illness, and often chronic illnesses that are not very common. So particular chronic illness, and often chronic illnesses that are not very common. So online can link them to support groups that might be available, that they don't get that support in their offline world. They'll find others who are experiencing the same things. It of course gives us great connections with other countries and cultures that we never had before, at least not in the time that I was a child. That really great understanding of how other cultures live enhances an understanding of globalisation and the world that we live in. There are also good positive options for entertainment and education, so finding those good options is the key. And again, sites that we'll show later, like raisingchildren.net.au, Common Sense Media, there's different sites that have ratings for content that you can draw on. And it's also a great creative outlet. There's lots of really good games and sites that engage children in a creative way. So things like with photography, drawing apps, coding, painting apps, great games like Scribblenauts, geocaching. If no one's ever done that with this age group, then it's a great tool to get online and to do something active with your child that also involves an app. Really great game to play. So there are ways of finding creative outlets online that is not necessarily offered offline as well. So a few of the positives that do happen. I'm going to talk a little bit about how social media is also a platform for social change. There's a trigger warning here that the content discussed on this slide might be upsetting for people who have survived gun violence. So if you'd like to mute the sound, you'll know that when the next slide comes on that we've changed the content. There won't be anything on the slide that we talk about that links to the story that has gun violence, but just so you know that if that's an issue for you, we can move to the next slide and mute the sound. So I want to talk a little bit about Emma Gonzalez. She was a normal school kid who attended Parkland High School in Florida. For those of you who know what happened in Parkland, it was the site of a school shooting on February 14th last year. 17 students and staff members died in that shooting. Emma made a very famous speech, which is worth looking at online. Again, a great tool for finding things that are of interest. For those of you who might have seen it, she is silent for 6 minutes of the speech, and it represents the 6 minutes that the children were exposed to the gun violence. It's an amazing and very powerful speech. And her involvement in this and in other groups such as some of the March for Our Lives and groups like that that are fighting for gun laws within the US, she's been very instrumental since the Parkland High School shootings around this. She now has 1.6 million Twitter followers, so you can see how the influence can be spread in a good way online, and very much socially engaged in what can happen around gun control, and they've had some great successes to date. The things that we want to look at when we think about whether technology use is good for our children is that the issue for this age group is that their brain is not yet fully developed. We know things like that impulsive behaviour is common at this age. Young people they actually biologically aren't capable of really controlling impulsive behaviour at this time. They have limited ability to reflect on the future consequences of their behaviour. So you can see how at this age, engaging in things like social media and cyberbullying is something that they get engaged in very quickly without really having the time to think about the effect that this may have. I'll tell you a story of my daughter and her experience that will give you an illustration of this. When she was in year 7, there was a game that was quite popular that was being played on Snapchat or Instagram where they would pick a child and then they would talk about that child in very negative tones. They would all say something that was something negative about that child. It wasn't until later that she realised that the child was upset with her, and she realised how that had impacted on a real world human. So it took some time to realise that, and what we did was then encouraged her to actually face that child in real life and apologise for her behaviour so that she could link the real life consequences of what happened to the way that that child felt. Very easy to get caught up in. So just be aware of the things that actually happen online that might happen like that. Children around this age are still quite anxious about how the world works and what this means for the safety of their friends and family. So having unlimited access to news stories, things that are happening online, will often still make them a bit anxious while they still are making sense of the world at this age. They're also acutely aware of changes to their bodies. So things that can impact on body image and give them wrong impressions around good, healthy behaviour around their bodies is worth being aware of, particularly the optical grandstanding and the feeds that happen on social media accounts such as Instagram and how they impact on body image and wellbeing. Some of the risks to watch out for, I won't go into a lot of detail. There's some really great information online about these things, but we will talk about them a little bit. Many things to be aware of. Cyberbullying is common at this age group. A lot of Year 7 teachers and principals dealing with the impact of cyberbullying at this age. Again, going back to not understanding the consequences of behaviour online. It is a platform for predators. So your child understanding that who is presented online might not be who they say they are. It does have addictive elements, so we need to be aware of that when we're setting limits and boundaries around use. And giving children a false sense of security. So children at this age having a lack of awareness of the public nature of online engagement. So being very clear with them, and we'll talk about how to set those boundaries and rules around understanding that public nature. Some of the antidotes for those cons. So with your child, run through some of the cyberbullying scenarios that might happen and the way that they'll react to them. And by this I mean also including information about what your child would do if they were a bystander to cyberbullying. How would they respond to that? Who might they talk to about it? Again, there's some really good resources on this material, so I won't go into detail, but again, running through them and doing some role playing with your child around cyberbullying scenarios. Don't leave it to schools or other sources of education to do that. Do it as a parent. Never disclosing personal information to anyone on social media. Don't share passwords, not even with friends. When my child was in this age group, there were endless stories about the fact that children had shared passwords with friends, the friendship group had fallen apart, and the friend had took it upon themselves to post things online under that child's name. Set social media accounts to private, really important one. So make sure that the settings aren't public. Means that your child can only talk to people that they accept as friends. Understanding what being a good digital citizen means. And again, that digital citizenship around responsibility and respect online. And ideally do this all before they're allowed access to social media and smartphone, so that the rules and the understanding is in place, and that's conditional on them having access to a phone or to social media accounts. Classic question, when should my child have a phone? Usually this tends to happen when their independence starts to increase. So towards the end of primary school, often they'll start to travel. They might want to travel to school alone or go with friends to the shopping mall, or go around to a friend's house, and you want to be able to contact them. Often that's when the questions start to arise. If your child says that they want a phone before then, you need to question their reasons for saying so. So start to interrogate them gently around why they would want to use a phone at that age, and really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, and that will give you some ideas around whether their reasons for wanting a phone are legitimate in your eyes or not. Don't forget that a dumb phone is an option. So before when I was putting this talk together, I actually Googled whether dumb phones still exist. And by that I mean phones that you can just make phone calls and texts on, like old school phones. So they are available. So consider whether, if you need it just for contacting your child at those times, maybe that's enough for now. Ask yourself questions about whether your child is responsible in other ways. So are they able to follow rules at home or at school? Can they take care of their belongings? Because I can't tell you how many phones they're going to lose in the first year that they have one. Have they shown responsibility in terms of the time when they're due home, when they start to be independent, notifying you of their whereabouts, doing chores, and also things that often aren't thought about. So whether you need a prepaid phone or contract phone, how much data they're using, and whether they are only allowed to use things like social media at home when they're on the home Wi-Fi, or whether they're allowed to use it outside of the home, which will be a pull on the data. So talking to them about downloading things like videos and how much data that will use, and battery life as well. And for those of you like me who thought an iPhone was a good idea, just be aware that the battery lasts for about 2 hours at a time. So pretty useless if they've gone out for the day. Think about the world that a smartphone introduces to your child. So I've put this image up there because if you wouldn't place your child alone in the middle of this picture with a t-shirt on that tells everyone what their name is, their date of birth, the school they attend, what their address is, and so forth, then that's what they are exposed to when you give them open access to the internet without the controls around it. So if you wouldn't do this in real life, think about what rules and boundaries and limits you want in place before a smartphone is given to your child for use. So I want you to remember this image and think about that and what you need to put in place every time you negotiate rules around use. So let's talk about those clear boundaries. And before we do talk about boundaries, I do want to mention that having access online and letting children go online does help to promote those skills that they need to negotiate the way that they use the online world. It helps them to understand what the risks are and to put themselves in positions where they can support friends or show resilience at times. So appropriate use and letting them go online actually helps them understand how that works. Not all screen time is equal. So the American Association of Pediatrics were the ones that developed the screen time recommendations in 1999, all the way back then, mostly around television use. And in that sense, the screen time guidance was particularly around passive activities. So TV use tends to be a very passive pastime. You're watching, you're not necessarily active in any way. They updated these guidelines in 2018 to reflect the fact that Often use of the internet and of social media and of other tools such as games, and now quite active use. You're often engaging with people. You might be moving if you're playing a sports game. And so these updated guidelines talks more about the type of use and what they're doing online and having an awareness of that and how that balances with offline activities. So making sure that children enjoy lots of healthy and fun activities both with and without screens, including physical activity, creative play, social time, both on and offline. And also that parents can often learn a lot by co-viewing and co-playing with their children and understanding what they're doing online. Okay, let's talk about limiting screen time. Don't let this get away from you. Much easier to set the limits and boundaries around this before that use happens. So if you're talking about getting a smartphone, what are the rules around that? Retrospectively applying limits to things like screen time is much harder. Not all screen time is equal. We've talked about that. So more active use of screens like collaborative gameplay, chatting to families, lots of really good educational content, which I brought up before. So places like Khan Academy, which has amazing educational content, all for free, for all the family. Things ranging from maths and science through to art, history, economics. Also things like TED Talks, some of them are appropriate to watch as a family and engage in educational content. Really good options online. And we've talked about balancing online and offline activities, making sure that the child has both. So here's some examples of what might be boundaries. Of course, it's up to each family to set their own boundaries around this use, but here's some examples for you. So it might be that the phone isn't in use when the child is doing homework, that it's only an hour per day, and it might be a set hour per day, so say between the hour before dinner or the hour after dinner or the hour after school, and that time is used for entertainment. It might be that everything is off, everyone's phones and everyone's technology is off at the end of the day in a public place in the house and on charge. You might opt to switch off the Wi-Fi overnight. One of the people who were part of the audience last week said, but they just go and turn it back on again, to which I say, then there's consequences for that. It might mean that if they're found to have turned it back on again, and that's a rule in the house, then you set consequences for that. The one consequence that I would just be careful about is setting consequences that involve taking the technology away from the child. The risk in doing so is that if something happens online to that child, then they're less likely to report it to you because of the fear that you will take technology away. So just have that discussion with the child before, so they understand what the consequences are and how the consequences will work if something like that happens. Another thing to do is draw up a contract with your child before they actually get the phone or get access to social media. This is what we call netiquette. So again, some ideas about what you might put into a contract. No technology in the bedroom. What I say is internet is a public space, therefore it's used in a public space within the house. If a child wants privacy in their bedroom, then that's a private space. You don't let the rest of the world into the bedroom with them. So internet is a public space that you use publicly. It's available where you can watch them and see what they're doing online. Tech off 1 hour before bedtime. This is not just a good rule to have, but what research shows is that helps to promote sleep. So important to shut down and be a good role model around this, that at some stage of the night, the technology goes off and it's wind down time. It might be a rule in this contract that they show you whenever they're asked, at least in the early days of use, what they're doing online. And again, it's in a public space so that you're able to see what they're doing and how they're engaging online. And also that part of their agreement around this, at least at the start when they start to use social media accounts, is that you know what the password is. Again, none of this is foolproof, but they're good general rules to have and that you understand with your child. Main thing that I would say is work with your child to set these rules rather than imposing the rules. You'll get much better success rate. Okay, just another note about this. Kids know themselves best. So if you want to know about the way that your child uses technology and what their expectations around them, talk to your child about it. Get online with them. Let them be the expert about what they use. Talk to them about their online world. Play the games with them. Some of them are really fun. Negotiate rules and limits with them, as I said. Generally, also, I wanted to point out that young people are actually quite good at policing each other online as well. So if your child has a good group of friends that will look out for them online and make sure that they look after each other's profiles and online credibility. So there is some policing that goes on in that online world, just to be aware of that. Let's talk a little bit about problematic use. So first thing again that I'd say is technology really is the tool. It's often a mask for what the real problem is. And those problems might be bullying or social anxiety or something that the teenager is experiencing where the online world is allowing them to self-soothe and to try and forget about those things. So just to be aware that what you see as problematic use might be a cover for something else that's going on for that child. When do we know if it's problematic or not? Difficult question, but one of the things that I use is and say is that it's when it's reasonably considered so by either the user of the technology or others who are affected by that use. So particularly when there's things like not a reasonable balance of online and offline activity that is in line with guidelines around this. And really consider this. So if you don't know whether you're being reasonable about what the child's use or not, gain some advice. Look at raisingchildren.net.au. Talk to other parents for ideas, not necessarily for putting in place exactly what they do, but test out how you're feeling about what's going on. Now talk a little bit more about two examples of tech use that are really common in this age group. And we talk a little bit about gaming and social media. Firstly, gaming, and again, I feel like I'm pushing all the positive uses, but the positive uses don't really get a lot of airtime generally, so I'm here to promote some of those. And what I'd say about gaming is that there are some benefits to this. So in terms of cognitive skills, some research says that with games there's improved spatial skills and hand-eye coordination. Now some of you might note that we've tried to trick you tonight by swapping over the headings in the other two circles. So you'll see that emotional is around regulating positive and negative emotions online. So especially when you're playing with other children online, again, it's able to test out some of those skills. And socially, so 3 and 4 gamers play with friends and it encourages cooperation and competition. For those of you who were here last week, I'll repeat the story of Charlie. So a parent was telling me that her child was quite anxious about the school transition into high school. But when he went along to the orientation day, he met some new friends there and they exchanged details and they were able to play online games over the holidays. And what that meant that was when the first day of school came in the new school year, Charlie felt a lot better and was able to go into the classroom and know some of the kids there. So again, that social part of that isn't always a bad thing. You might ask yourself, or you'll have other people asking, is your child gaming too much? Ask yourself some of these questions. Does your child still engage and have real world friends? If they start to drop off, you might want to start to question their use. Is the child handling the demands of schoolwork and homework, or are you starting to see a drop off in this? Is your child developing in an expected way? Are they engaging in increasing independence and responsibility? You'd really want by the end of the primary school years for your child to start to show that they want to be independent from family, that they want to start meeting with friends at the shopping centre or at the ice skating rink or going to parties. If that starts to decrease rather than increase, then that's when you'd be asking some questions about the impact of things like gaming. Does your child have other hobbies? So do they still engage in the sports like they did, the art like they did, the drama like they did? Do they engage with other children in the same way as they did before? All good questions to ask about whether the gaming is taking over. The other thing to draw attention to is whether they're playing single player or multiplayer games. So if it's multiplayer games, the questions to ask are things like, are they able to take a break from the game? Or is there an expectation from the team that they play with that they continue to play to avoid defeat? Is there pressure on them to do that? There might be physical signs as well. So some of the classics that gets talked about are things like they can't concentrate on anything else. They're constantly craving getting back to the game. In extreme cases, they might be neglecting hygiene. So they're staying in their room, they're not washing. They're lying about how much they're playing. Again, going back to whether they have real friends or not. If the friendships start to break down, then it's worth looking at. If the child is getting reluctant to leave the house. So again, if you're worried about these sorts of things, talk to a GP, talk to family support people or other professionals to get some ideas around how to deal with these issues. Shifting to social media use. So one of the main things that I really like parents to understand is that most of these sites, and again, the most common one for parents to understand is that most of these sites, and again, the most common ones used by teenagers at the moment are things like Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube. These sites require the user to open an account only when they're 13 years of age. And this is related to the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act in the US, but it still applies because a lot of these social media companies are run from the US. And the Act is there to protect children's privacy online and insulate them from online marketing that's based on their profile. So when you sign up for these accounts, you need to be 13. If you're not, then you have to lie about your birthday. So it's worth talking to your child about and to make sure that they know that. So often, I really encourage parents to understand that there's a good reason and a legitimate reason to hold off on social media accounts until your child is 13. And often by then, they've also settled into a secondary school environment a little more. I want to talk about who decides when a social media account is open for a child. And the bottom line is you, not your child. Not your child's friends. No doubt they'll come home with stories about, but Johnny's parents let him have an Instagram account. He's had it for the past 2 years, to which you say, that's great to hear about how Johnny's parents have dealt with this. In our household, this is the way that it works. And that's the end of the conversation for now. They might open one, and not your child's friend's parents. So again, you'll often hear that, well, such and such parents let them have an account. And you might hear from other parents about their views about it. Again, really important to know that you make that ultimate decision about whether it's the right time for your child or not. Again, using some of those strategies that we thought about before. Do they show responsibility? Do they show respectful communication and behaviour with their friends and their siblings? Do you think that they are old enough to be able to handle what happens online? Are you confident that if something happens that is bothering them online, that they would tell you or tell another trusted adult? Important questions to ask. Also be aware that they might open an account anyway. So you have to ask themselves, is it better to negotiate with them around this? The classic one that young people do that I saw endlessly with my daughter's friends was that they would open an account anyway. They'd hide it away in the back blocks of their phone so that if their parents opened their phone, they wouldn't be able to see it straight away. And they'd use it anyway. The other trick is that they'll open one that their parents have access to, and then they'll open a separate account themselves. So I'd encourage you to try and get around that. Again, nothing is foolproof, but to be able to negotiate that with your child and to talk to them about what are the things that you want to have in place before and talking to them and negotiating with them about that. Again, setting up a netiquette agreement, limiting their use in the early days, monitoring their use over time. Lastly, I just want to draw attention to online pornography, and the reason why is that this is the most prominent sexuality educator for young people, and it starts early. And it's not necessarily intentional access to pornography. Often it will be unintentional. But the reality is that most young people have been exposed at some point or another, and at quite young ages. Again, I'll show you a couple of really good sites that can give you information about this shortly. But really important to say, don't leave this to schools, don't leave this to online. Parents play a really important role in sexuality and relationships education. Here's some resources, and I'll show you one for pornography in a minute. One of the great resources that's available for parents is the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner. Here you can actually report cyberbullying incidents. You can report illegal content, and you can report any image-based abuse. The eSafety site has an iParent site as well, which has specific education resources for parents. The other thing to mention is that most of the social media accounts also, most of the social media sites also have guides for parents that are attached to that actual social media type. So go to the sites and have a look around and find their guides for parents. Another couple of really good resources. We've talked about raisingchildren.net.au tonight. There's a specific area of that site that is around this age group. Reach Out Parents has a great site with information on this. And if you want to know and learn more about online pornography, be ahead of the game, I strongly recommend the It's Time We Talk site to start to get your head around some of the issues. Another site which is great around talking to young people about love, sex and relationships is the Love, Sex and Relationships website. So go and have a look at those and see what's on there.
As we're finishing up, we might just come back onto the screen as we go through these final hints and tips. What can you sum up for us, Elly, around all this information tonight?
Sure. So final hints and tips, all the things we talked about tonight. Understanding why your child wants to use technology and acting accordingly. Knowing that each child is different. So within a family, things might be different for one child who shows greater responsibility than another. Your child is different from their friends. It's up to you to be able to set those boundaries. Making your own informed decisions is related to that. Bear in mind that technology is a tool. It's often not the problem. So getting beneath the technology to understand what's going on for the child. And that I've talked a lot about the positives tonight and really driving that home, that this is not all negative. And if you're confident and you have the boundaries in place and setting the limits, negotiating with your child around the use, then they'll be able to gain those positives from that use as well. So I'll hand back to Kim.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, we're sort of, as we can see, we're wrapping up. We're coming to a section now where you can ask whatever questions you would like of Elly. Now, we have covered quite a lot. Not to worry. As we mentioned earlier, there will be a recording coming out in the next few days. So feel free to watch that, go over it again. We'll also be sending out a handout of these slides, and it will include some of those things, some extra resources. But also I saw a question, someone was asking about the games that you were talking about earlier, Elly. So there was the geocaching and the Scribblenauts. So we'll make sure we get the correct spelling of that one, and we'll add that to the resources for you. We had one question that came in from Sama recently. So do you think that what works for USA necessarily works for Australia with regards to the minimum age for using social media?
Yep. So just to be clear, a lot of the social media sites work under the US protection, the Online Protection and Privacy Act that relates to children. So that's why when you go to those social media sites and sign up, it will ask for the age and what your birth date is. So those sites are under US law. In terms of whether it works in Australia or not, it depends. It's a guide in terms of the legality of collecting information within the US. So that's what they're required to work under. And generally speaking, it's a good guide to say, well, if they set that legal limit as saying that's when we think that exposing children to marketing or to other things that happen when they use social media, that's what we see as the correct age for the developmental ability to understand what's happening for them. That's a good enough guide for me.
Okay, all right, fantastic, thank you. We had some questions that came in earlier. So we'll go through a couple of those, but also we understand that if you do need to leave now, thank you so much for joining us. We will just ask you to complete a very, very quick survey. The survey will come up at the end of the webinar if you stay with us. Otherwise, I'll ask Tony to see if he can just put up the link to it now. But we'll go through some of the other questions. There was one around how to help children manage their own screen time.
Okay, it's a great question. Gets the same rules as when you're thinking about how to set it yourself. So what I'd be talking to your child about right from a very young age is how you balance things in your life, how you get a balance of online and offline activities, why being outside and getting fresh air is important, why being with friends is important. Keeping on building those messages so that when you start to talk about the use of technology, it's a part of their life. It's not everything. You limit that and you put boundaries in place in the same way as other things, that you talk to your child about all of their life, about not eating too much sugar, not doing other things. I can't think of other examples off the top of my head, but the idea is setting those boundaries and negotiating those with your child all the way through their childhood, and this is just another example of that.
Okay. I guess it also has the element of the modelling that I think we mentioned earlier as well.
Yeah, really important. And I think, you know, there's some research that's come out recently about how if you listen to what children say about, I really wish my mum would, or my dad would put down their phone and talk to me occasionally. So being really aware of how your technology use is role modelling that use for your child.
Yeah, okay. So another one has just come in from Julie. Can you discuss average age children that are getting mobile phones and about bullying for not having one?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. There probably are some stats out there about the average age children are getting phones. I'm not sure. If I find something, we can put it into the resources.
Yep.
Good question about bullying for not having one. I guess, again, it's something where a couple of things come up. One is to be aware that even if your child doesn't have a social media account or a phone, doesn't mean they're not being talked about or engaged, that they're not being talked about by other children online. So you're still giving them the same techniques and the same strategies to deal with those sorts of behaviours, whether they're online, they're offline, whether they're part of it or whether they're not. Bullying for not having one, again, using the same skills as you would do with bullying around anything. Having a look at some of the bullying resources, what skills and what strategies would you give your child around bullying, and handling that in the same way as any other example.
Okay. I noticed a couple of people also talking about the impact on their children for not playing these certain games that all their peers and friends are playing. Is that a similar sort of situation?
Yeah, I mean, again, these things come and go, so I'd be encouraging you to hold off still. It might be the game of the day, and I know probably people are really keen to talk about Fortnite.
That did come up.
Yeah, I would have to say I don't know a lot about the game itself, but yeah, look, it makes it tough for kids, but I guess, again, you've got to put aside the short-term impact for the longer-term gain. So again, giving them some strategies, building friendships outside of that friendship group. So again, connecting your kids to sporting clubs, drama clubs, something that gives them other interests, so that when they get locked down in those conversations, they can turn to other friends or they can talk about other things. So, you know, bear in mind, these things come and go. So don't feel pressured that just because one game is the flavour of the day that's a problem.
Okay, fantastic. I noticed that there were some comments from parents saying that they were getting online and playing them as well. And I think there was a comment from someone saying that their son really, really wanted to play this game, and the parent wasn't really that keen, but they downloaded it and started playing, and then the son went, no, I actually don't really get it. So that's
So great strategy. Don't have a look. That's a really good way of doing it. If your child's talking about a game, go and look it up with them. Have a look at the game. Talk them through it. Again, there's some really good guidance online that talk about these games, and again, I'll try and find it to put into the resources, but there's a site that actually talks about how to have a conversation with your child about that particular game.
Okay.
So I'll try and dig those up, because
great.
Again, it's a discussion piece and guidance around discussions you can have about the content, that particular content. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so let's have a quick look. So if there's any other questions, I do have a few more though, but you've got a few more minutes to jump in and ask any more questions. One of the other ones that came in earlier during the registration process was from Shannon around how to monitor what your child's looking up and limit internet time better.
Yeah,
I guess is another question.
Yeah. So I haven't talked about filters tonight. It's probably good to look up and look at some reviews about what the best filters are and what people are using these days. How to limit what they're using. Again, those filters will allow only certain websites to be used or not. Smart kids will find their way around a filter really quickly. So again, the way to get around that is to have those conversations with them. What can they use? What can't they use? Having a look at the sites that they might want to use that you're not so sure about with them, same strategy. You know, you might want to put limits on what they can and can't use, and to be able to have consequences if they end up somewhere else. So yeah, lots of ways of limiting it, making sure again that whatever they're using is in a public space so that you're able to monitor their use of that all the time.
Okay, no, that's a really good point. So I noticed we've just got one that's coming in from Lisa, worrying about their child watching short clips on YouTube and what it's doing to their concentration. Yep. I can probably relate to that one. But as Liz said, if you're worrying it unnecessarily.
Yeah, look, there's quite a bit of talk around decreased attention spans due to things like short videos, short shows, using social media. Again, things like language use, so the way that language has changed with using social media and so forth. All legitimate concerns. Again, I'd be saying try and balance these things out with other activities. So if they're watching short videos, last week I talked about rituals and traditions for families. So it might be that you put something in place where Friday nights are where the family get together. You all watch a full-length film together and have pizza, whatever you do on a Friday night, so that, you know, and again, it might be on Saturday morning, going for a bike ride together, going for a walk together, organised sport, whatever it is that starts to balance out some of the things that are happening online with other positive activities.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Now, this is a sort of a theme that came up a little bit, but how to control screen time without a fight was one question that Agnes had for us.
Yeah, good luck. Look, you know, this goes back to good communication with your children, and again, sending out the slides from last week will help as well. Same as with anything, setting good ways of communicating with your child, disconnecting from any technology while you're doing that, making sure that you're listening to them, you're making eye contact, you're giving them a chance to talk, letting them put their point of view across. One thing that I say for slightly older teens, but this is worth keeping in mind, is making sure that they're able to put their point of view across. Okay. What's their argument for having what they want? Give them the airtime to say that to them. And then you can say, I'll consider that, I'll talk to my partner about that, I'll talk to whoever. You might say, look, it's a really great argument, I really appreciate listening to you, I'm still not quite sure about that now, but I'm happy for you to come back in a couple of weeks' time and start, you know, and give that to me again. Yeah. By that stage, they've probably forgotten all about it. Okay, so that's the bonus of it. Yeah. So just good communication is the key there.
All right, fantastic. Another one has just come in around setting boundaries, and what about if you have children at different age groups? So yep. An example here, teenager and preteen, needing more time for homework, and balancing that out across those age groups in the family.
Yeah. Again, I think that's about negotiating between the different age groups about what's appropriate for each age, explaining to your younger child as to why your older child needs to do the things that they do, understanding that that's an age-appropriate thing for them to do, discussing with them about and setting different agreements with them around their use. So same as anything to do with siblings and the different age groups is setting those boundaries in the way that makes sense.
They get to stay up later and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's the benefits of being older. You'll get there in the end.
Now, one that came up from Yelena was how to handle difficult questions like, why am I not being allowed online?
Why am I not being allowed online?
Yeah, why aren't you letting me online?
Yeah, well, again, I'd go back to what the rules are that you've set around that. So the best thing to avoid that is for everyone to have a really good idea about what the rules are and what the boundaries are around that already. Mm-hmm. So that if you've set that with your child to say, your time to use entertainment online is between 4 and 5 p.m. on weekdays. On the weekends, you might get a little bit more time between 10 and 12. Mm-hmm. That's the time that we've set for you to use that. If you come to me and ask whether you can be online outside of those times, then the answer is no.
Okay. Harsh.
Don't be scared to say no.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Yeah. Well, I think that seems as though we've actually covered a lot of the questions that have been covered that were asked either earlier or during the session tonight. If you do have anything else, please feel free to jump on. We're here for a few more minutes, but I will just take you through just a few things just to finish up. So there will be the survey at the end, which we'll see in a few minutes. If you stay to the end, it'll just pop up for you at the very end. Otherwise, Tony has put the link for you in the chat, and you can jump on that right now. It takes all of 2 minutes. We just love to hear how you find it and what we can do to improve it. So one of the things from last week was asking about some of those resources that Elly did talk about. And yes, we listened. They are in that handout for you. And yes, everyone who attends tonight, as I mentioned, will not only get the recordings for both last week and this week, but you'll also get the handouts for last week and for this week as well. And so we will have yeah, as I said, a couple of minutes. But now, if there was anything in this evening's webinar that did cause you to have any concerns, or you want to go somewhere to ask a few more questions, Elly has given us a plethora of wonderful resources to look at. But of course, there is raisingchildren.net.au. They have helplines and parent lines, which are specific to the different states. So jump online and have a look there. They also have a huge amount of information for preteens, as well as technology use as well. Okay, so yes, recording and handout will be handed out. And now I just want to check, was there anything else that you want to take advantage of this time to share with these wonderful people who have joined us? It's so great to have everyone here.
Yeah. Look, I think going back to what I said last week, make the most of these years. Teenage years come about very quickly, very rapid change around that time. So make the best thing about the preteen years is that you can still be the loudest voice in their ears about what they do. There's 1,000 different voices in their ears by the time they're teenagers. Make the most of having that audience with them while you can. And enjoy these years. They're a great, teenagers are fantastic. They're really fun. They're amazing, and they don't get a lot of good press. So make the most of those years and enjoy it.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, we do have a last question here. Now, asking about if I haven't set rules for my children, and I'm guessing this is around the technology use, and now cannot control the time that my kids are using technology. Yes, I should have kept reading. What should I do now?
Yep. Retrospectively applying the rules is hard, but you have to be hard line. So start to, again, sit down your kids, start to talk to them about what the rules should be, negotiate with them around those rules. Hard to do, but it's really important to do it. So you can frame it in a way of saying, look, there's new research out that says this, or, I've heard this, and, these things are really important. I want to increase what we do offline. Let's talk about that as a family and start to set up some new rules about that. You might get complaining, you will get complaining, you'll get stomping, you'll get slammed doors, but stay firm, make those rules for your family. It's up to you as the parents to be the adult brain for your child while their brain is still developing. So stay firm, set those goals in place, and you'll be fine.
Okay, lots of deep breaths. Okay, wonderful. Well, I think that's all we have time for now. We'd like to thank Elly so much for coming along and sharing with us, and I would like to thank you all for joining us as well. You've had some wonderful contributions, both before the webinar and during the webinar tonight. Now, we'll be signing off. We hope to see you at another webinar in the future. As I mentioned, we do have one coming up in March on anxiety, so stay tuned. You can see the raisingchildren.net.au Facebook to keep an eye out for those ones coming up, or as I mentioned, you can subscribe for those webinars. But look, thank you again. Have a lovely evening, and hopefully see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.